called what Christian Europe emerges, or the emergence of Christian Europe, 600 to 1200. There's not a single word of that series that everybody could agree on, either that that should be a topic or that it was the best label for the topic. And so we simply adopted it. It's the point at which the book begins to overlap a certain tradition of Western Civ, not the Western Civ of the 1950s, but rather the Western Civ of the earlier 20th century. This is a copy of the syllabus for History 1 at Harvard University, circa 1931. The title of the course was European History from the Fall of the Roman Empire to the Present Time, and the last chapter deals with World War I. It is a syllabus of the sort that no one does anymore. That is to say, it has several pages of instructions on how to take notes, how to think about authors, and so forth and so on. But what it also reflects is a view that was very common in that generation and earlier, that Western civilization begins in the aftermath of the fall of Rome, as opposed to the Western Civ textbooks of the 50s and 60s that started with river valley civilizations and went through Greece and Rome, and then picked up the story of Europe. The story of Europe was seen as a coherent and autonomous narrative that warranted being the first and foremost subject of a college history curriculum, hence the label History 1. The reasons for that are not hard to seek. There was certainly an assumption in that era that Western civilization, meaning Euro-American civilization, was the pinnacle of human achievement and was pointing the way in big fat neon, well, maybe not in 31, but big fat, letters toward the future. And to some degree, when you added Greece and Rome and the early Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations to it, that focus began to become diluted. And people began to think, well, really, what does Alexander the Great have to do with Europe? His conquests were mostly in Asia. Or what do the Sumerians have to do with Europe, even if they did think up the idea of 360 degrees in the circle. So the story of Europe for such a long time held pride of place. Then it began to dwindle. But when we do world history today, in virtually every textbook, that is to say, when we do narrative world history as opposed to simply comparative studies on this or that dimension of world history or on this or that theme, when we do narrative world history, at some point the European story takes on a special character, and it gets reasserted in chapters. You're much more likely to have the European chapters be freestanding, just Europe alone, as opposed to comparative or devoted to contact with other areas, at least up to the point of the voyages of exploration in the 15th, 16th centuries. Now, another approach to things, and that's the old European the old special role for Europe approach. Another approach that I want to mention here is one that comes out of social science, particularly political science and economics. And this is the idea of path dependence or path dependency. You can use either term. When you examine the evolution of something, and by evolution here I mean the development over time of an institution, of a economic structure, of a social configuration, of a political ideology. When you look at these things over time, what certain social scientists have asked, but not generally historians, is whether it could have come out differently. If you believe that it could not have come out differently, then you are arguing that the variables that appear in the historical narrative wouldn't really have changed much of anything. On the other hand, if you say that those variables, those specific actions or events, in fact could have gone in other ways and changed everything, then you're talking about path dependence. And you're saying that the subject that you're looking at depends upon the particular path that events took. And sometimes that referred to as the theory that history matters. Now, historians always have thought that history mattered. And so they tend to take umbrage at the idea that you might say that history doesn't matter. On the other hand, there are cases to be made that that there are events or changes that occur that are going to have outcomes that really are more or less independent of the particulars of the events or the responses to the events. Say an obvious one is if you have a pandemic that removes half your population, you're going to have a fall in agricultural production. Now, that fall may be managed in different ways, it may manifest itself in different ways, but you're going to have it because you've taken away so much labor and taken away so much demand that is going to happen. Now this is, in a sense, self-evident, as so much of what political scientists and economists do is. But there is a propensity in those disciplines to take particular case studies and say, look, this happened, therefore this had to happen, therefore this had to happen, therefore this had to happen, and to string essentially inevitabilities along and say this was necessarily the outcome. You have a great deal of discussion today about the financial crisis and whether, given, say, deregulation, that inevitably it was going to result in bubbles. The bubbles were inevitably going to burst. Everybody was going to be unemployed. There'd be miserable unhappiness, and Sarah Palin would become president. And you could say, well, this really is not path dependent, except the Sarah Palin part. This is simply what was scripted because of the nature of it. And when you read particularly Keynesian economists who say, we can just see the rates of this and that and how they develop, and we can see that this had to happen the way it did happen, and it doesn't depend that much upon the particular path. Okay, now for European history, what has happened is that leaving aside what seems to be obvious, namely that a whole lot of things happened in Europe, and that surely if they'd happened differently, we would have come out differently. Nevertheless, you do have the notion that, that Europe went through a series of changes, and that those changes constitute a template, and that that template is something that can be transferred to other parts of the world. In other words, if you have a church and a middle class and such, then they will lead to liberal revolutions, then they will lead to democracy, then you will lead to the triumph of big business or whatever. So that when people have dealt with European history, rather unconsciously, they have implied often that what happened in Europe had to happen that way. You didn't really have, you know, this is just the way it had to go. Now, some people would say, well, that's, you know, they had to go that way because they were Europeans. They were, you know, brighter and whiter and, you know, had more testosterone than other people in the world, except the women in Europe who we don't care about, and that therefore it's a question of a racial outcome. And clearly that is an outworn idea now, except among a very substantial proportion of the population. So there are ways of explaining that. The problem there, of course, is that how do you use the European template to shift to other parts of the world? And of course, one of the answers is you declare other parts of the world to be honorary white people, as the Japanese became. Even before the Meiji Restoration in the 1850s, the Dutch in Indonesia recognized the Japanese as European whites because the Japanese had recognized the Dutch as people whom they permitted to do business in Japan, and the most favored nation concept meant that if the Japanese recognized the Dutch had to offer an equal recognition. So you had this odd thing that you know, Ottomans, citizens in Indonesia under the Dutch were listed as Eastern foreigners, whereas Japanese in Indonesia were listed as European whites. All right, I want to sort of take two different approaches this week. Today I want to talk about the peculiarities of Europe. And then on Thursday, I want to talk about a situation in which you might argue, and indeed I would argue, that things happened in Europe that had to happen the way they did, regardless of the peculiarities. And then the question is that if you have a mix of both path-dependent developments and let's say developments for which one can argue that there is an applicable you know, logic that follows the rationality that could conceivably of the political science or the economists, it could conceivably be reduced to an equation. Can you have it both ways? Can you say Europe is special, and at the same time Europe does what you know, what any society under those circumstances would do? And then in the following week I will raise the test case of China in the medieval period, which is now one of the hottest and most discussed comparisons in world history. You know, whether or not China in the immediate pre-Mongol period was not only equal to but superior to Europe according to various economic measures that have so frequently been used to indicate the special condition of Europe. All right, One of the first things you get to is what is Europe? The chapter title says Christian Europe. Well, it says Christian Europe because Spain and Portugal weren't part of it. But Russia does become part of it. And so now you're extending Europe as far east as Russia, perhaps, at a time when Russia was a pretty wild frontier of Slavic villagers and farmers exploited by Swedish warriors who came down the rivers from the north and set up principalities. Not only that, but you have the situation of the Byzantine Empire. Somewhere you have to discuss the Byzantine Empire. Do you discuss it with Rome, which makes it very difficult to compare Rome with the Han Dynasty in China because the Byzantine Empire is the later Roman Empire, the Bas Empire, the Low Empire. But that starts around 300 or so, and this chapter is supposed to start around 600. So the first A head, the first date mentioned is 332, because immediately it proved impossible to write the chapter without overriding the chronological limits for the chapter. But not only that, but the heart of the Byzantine Empire was not in Europe. In fact, the capital of the Byzantine Empire was just barely in Europe, on the what is today Istanbul, Constantinople, on the Golden Horn, which is on the European side of the Bosphorus, separating Europe and Asia Minor or Anatolia. So you start out, oddly, talking about parts of the Roman Empire that did not become part of post-Roman Europe. And it's a very important distinction because the eastern parts of the Roman Empire, particularly Egypt and Syria and Turkey or Anatolia, these were very prosperous areas. They were not overwhelmed by Germanic folk migrations or invasions, whatever you want to call them. Cities remained prosperous, coinage remained sound, business and manufacturing continued. None of these things were true of the portion of the Roman Empire that we think of as the Western Roman Empire, which comes to an end in the fourth quarter of the 5th century. So Christian Europe emerges. Raises questions. One possibility, which I think would be interesting to explore if I were to write a book in competition with my own book, would be to say, why don't we divide the West and the East and take the history of the western part of Greco-Roman antiquity, that is to say, the Western Roman Empire and the Maghreb and Spain, that is to say, the western possessions of the Muslims and the old western part of the Roman Empire, and have a chapter just on them. And then have another chapter that deals with the East, that deals with the Mashriq, the eastern Islamic lands, along with Byzantium and possibly Kiev and Russia. Because, of course, one of the things that's clear in both European and Islamic historical traditions and political traditions is that there's a profound difference between Eastern and Western Europe, and a profound difference between Eastern and Western Islamic states. And here I'm not referring to the extensions of Islam into India or Indonesia or down into Africa, but simply the Middle East and North Africa. So you could group them in that way. Now, why wouldn't you do that? One reason you don't do it is that where do you put the narrative of Muhammad and the rise of Islam? Now, you could say, have a chapter on Byzantium and Islam in the East, and tell the story of Muhammad there and the story of Charlemagne, not Charlemagne, but of Constantine, and then tell the story of Charlemagne and the conquest of Spain and so forth in a subsequent chapter. You could do that, but nobody does it. And I think the reason nobody does it that way, although in many ways it would make a lot more sense, is because it seems to diminish the special character of Europe. So the things you talk about, you have, as in History 1 of 1931, Lecture 1, actually, first you have something called the background of European history, for which you read Edward Gibbon, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Then you have the later Roman Empire, reading Thorndike's History of Medieval Europe. Then you have the rise of the Christian Church, followed by the Germanic invasions and the Frankish Empire, followed by feudalism and serfdom, followed by the rise and spread of Mohammedanism, which is coming along hundreds of years after its chronological point. Then you have the East and the Crusades. You had to put the Mohammedans in there so that you could explain the Crusades, and then that's the last you hear of the Mohammedans for a long time. Then you got commerce and the rise of towns, the Holy Roman Empire, the making of France, medieval England, etc., etc. So Europe is, people are loath still to deconstruct Europe in terms of a narrative. And a lot of that arises from the interest in the Christian church. The Christian church, tacitly or implicitly, should be treated as a unity in the way that Islam is treated. In other words, it would be wrong to divide Islam, and it would be wrong to divide the Christian church, because these are the great institutional and ideological edifices of an era where you had, particularly in Europe, deeply divided political territory, and in the Islamic world, somewhat more unity, but a unity that broke down comparatively early in the history of Islam. So the church and the Ummah, the community of Muslims, seem to provide a central focus, but it's awkward to see it as a narrative focus, because the church and Islam, qua religion, do not fit that well a narrative approach. By putting these things in separate chapters, Islam and the rise of the church in separate chapters, it becomes, it kind of overlooks the fact that these two religious traditions are phenomenally similar. It's phenomenally similar. I have likened them to Siamese twins separated at birth and brought up in separate homes, and they hate each other. But they are so very similar, and the similarity is not fundamentally doctrinal. It's true that all three have a, that is to say, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, because the Jews have to be in there someplace, and they're very difficult to shoehorn in. You have to have something on the Jews, but what are you going to say about the Jews? It's awkward. But all three of these religions have myths that go back to someone named Abraham or Ibrahim, so they can be talked about the Abrahamic faiths, for example. But leaving the doctrines aside, you have extraordinary similarities between Christianity, particularly Western Christendom, and Islam, that you don't find if you throw all three religions in together. I've made this argument in a book I published called The Case for Islamo-Christian Civilization. To my disappointment, many of my Jewish readers never got past the title page, finding it so offensive not to be included, or let me see, I think the New York Times said gratuitously and pejoratively excluded or something like that. You know, how do you dare mention Muslims and Christians and not mention Jews? And you really do have to read into the book all the way to, I think, page 2 to get a fairly explicit explanation of why. Because I'm not writing about theology or scripture, but rather about institutional developments. And the institutional developments that are the most interesting are those that have to do with what the Europeans call a clergy and what the Muslims call the ulama, which is a plural of a word alim, which means someone who possesses ilm, which is the word for science or concrete knowledge. In other words, it is scientia in Latin. Now, in the medieval period, ilm was more often, in this sense, used in its plural. Ulum, meaning the sciences in the plural of the faith. In other words, the notion of science was not the modern notion of science, but rather it's the concrete, real and undoubted knowledge that exists with respect to the faith. So an alim was a specialist who had substantial knowledge about Islam, and the plural, the ulama, meant those people who were the scholars or the knowledgeable people in the Islamic world, and this word is used today. Still the common word in Arabic and Turkish, in Persian, what we find more often is the word mullah, and plural mullahs, meaning the Iranian clergy. The word clergy is avoided because Muslim traditions are very clear in their belief that not having a formally defined clergy was a mark of superiority of Islam. So there are no monks in Islam, there are no clerics in Islam, and there are no mysteries, seemingly, by which a ritual would confer a spiritual role upon someone that was a mystical role. In other words, there's nothing like the ordination of clergy that empowered a Christian clergyman to preside over a mass in which, through the intercession of the Almighty, the bread and the wine were converted into the body and blood of Christ. This miracle of the Eucharist, the conversion of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, as the central drama of the Catholic Mass, or of the Christian Mass prior to the Reformation, it really is of extraordinary importance, both in and of itself as a spiritual belief, and because it defined who could do it. You had to be an ordained priest. So that kind of thing, where you can have in a mosque someone who serves giving the call to prayer and he receives a salary, someone who serves as an imam, who's the head of the mosque and who leads prayers, or a khatib, a person who gives the noon prayer on Friday. You can have salaried positions of great prestige in connection with mosque rituals, but they're not clergy. There's no ordination, and you can swap these people out. And when you are in a mosque and the imam of the mosque stands in front and you pray behind him, it is no different from if you are with a dozen friends in a living room and you pray behind one of these friends. It's, there's no gift of the Holy Spirit. There's no divine or mysterious sanction to this sort of thing. So the clergy, the term clergy doesn't get used in Islamic circles. And therefore people think that they are entirely different. But of course they're not. They're remarkably the same. But the differences are interesting differences. Let me talk about three. First one is the issue of language. You had a liturgical language, that is to say, a language used for Holy Scripture and for the rituals of the church or of the mosque. You had a liturgical language on both sides. Latin in Catholic Europe, Roman Catholic Europe, Greek, and to a lesser degree Syriac for the Eastern Orthodox churches, and Arabic for Islam. These languages were understood variously by the bodies of believers who heard things in them. Most Muslims have, say at the present day, do not understand the Quran when they hear it recited. Because they're not Arabic speakers, and most of them have not gone to a school to learn how to understand the Quran, and it has absolutely no impact upon the degree to which they can be moved and spiritually uplifted by hearing the Quran recited. You don't have to know Italian to get all weepy when Mimi dies and all that, and La Boheme. The language is less important than the context. So you have these languages that spread very widely, and clearly they provide a link that defines different civilizational or different cultural areas. Latin defines Western Christendom. Greek more or less defines Eastern Christendom, although you have more variation there. And Arabic defines Islam. Some people understood Latin or Arabic or Greek much better than others. But the notion that you had a single language seems to be a very important thing. Now, in Europe, Latin dies. Say in England, by the early 1600s, people in Oxford and Cambridge, in the colleges, were still taught to read and write in Latin, but they were no longer taught to speak Latin. In 1400, you still had people who spoke Latin if they had been trained to do it. But gradually, the notion of the Latin as a spoken language dies, and it is supplanted, of course, by a whole series of Latinate languages, Romance languages, and also by a series of languages that are not rooted in Latin, although they ended up having very substantial Latin vocabularies, say Germanic, Scandinavian, Celtic languages. And you think, okay, the division into languages is sort of a vagary of European history. But people who are really into European history will say, no, that's a really important vagary, because nations divide along the lines of languages. And when you come to the 18th century, and even more to the 19th century, the specificity of language, as opposed to the generality of language, becomes the core of nationalism. And that nationalism then becomes the typical ideology of the modern nation state. And so in other parts of the world, we should see the same thing if Europe is a template. So is it natural for a universal cultural language to devolve into a group of different languages? Or is that a very particular European situation? And is it reasonable to take, if it is a particular European situation, is it reasonable for Benedict Anderson, who has written so much on language as the bedrock foundation of modern nationalism, is it reasonable to take that as something that is a general case? That is to say that nationalism will arise when you have this devolution of languages from a universal tongue of education, refinement, and culture to a congeries of separate languages. The idea that you can look at language and say, here is where nationalism comes from, comes a cropper when you look at India, which we haven't talked about in this context, but India had a universal language of education, scripture, culture, and higher attainments of all kinds, and that language was Sanskrit. The Sanskrit language undergoes the same thing that Latin undergoes in Europe. That is to say, you have a devolution of a Sanskrit culture into a whole series of separate languages that are derived from Sanskrit, and very, very easily derived from Sanskrit, and yet not necessarily mutually intelligible, or indeed not mutually intelligible. And another set of languages that among people who used Sanskrit once for scriptural and cultural purposes, but whose basic languages were not derived from Sanskrit, particularly those people in southern India who speak languages belonging to the Dravidian family. So you would say, well, if Europe is a template in some way, then when we look at the language history of Europe, the language history of India, we should come up with the same thing. We should come up with an India that's full of nation states that have capitalized upon their linguistic identity, because that's what you got in Europe. If it's a general phenomenon, and some people have directly investigated this idea. I'm thinking particularly of a professor at the University of Michigan, Farina Mir, who did a doctoral dissertation on Punjabi. Said Punjabi qualifies in every respect to be a national language. It has a literature, it has a folkloric base, it's broken into dialects, but the dialects are fairly mutually intelligible. It's concentrated in a single region, but it has never given rise to a political movement demanding a Punjabi state. Yeah. Well, is it a Punjabi state in Pakistan or a Punjabi state in India? Well, no, well, those are the six. Because the Punjabis are divided between two countries, India and Pakistan, and three religions. Islam, Hinduism, and Sikhism. Now, there are certainly nationalistic Punjabis, but some of them are nationalistic Pakistanis, and some are nationalistic Indians. Some of them are nationalistic Punjabis, but they're not pan-Punjabi in that respect. That's coming out of the Sikh side of it. Anyway, this is the argument she made in the book, and I recommend the book to pursue it further. I'm just giving that as an example of where you can go in asking whether language is truly important. Now, if you were to take Europe and Islamic comparison, then you'd look at Arabic and you'd say, Arabic never broke down. This would be wrong, of course, because the colloquial Arabic spoken in Oman or in Morocco or in Lebanon or in Egypt, these are not mutually intelligible, but they never broke down in the way that Latin did into clearly distinct languages that that became the core of national identities, or in modern terms of nationalist ideologies. Classical Arabic remains the standard, remains what everyone is expected to learn or claim to learn. It is the base of what is often called modern standard Arabic, which basically means modern Arabic as spoken on Egyptian radio and television. It has to do more with the rise of radio and television than it does in movies than it does with language. But then so then you say, okay, Arabic does become the basis of nationalism, but it's the basis of pan-Arab nationalism. All of us who speak Arabic are one great big nation, whereas the Europeans never said all of us who come from a Latin background are one great big nation. You know, there was never a pan-Romance unit. People who spoke Romance languages killed each other with ferocity on remarkable frequency. But Arabic gets sort of reinvented as a basis for a nationalism that has a sad and unsuccessful history, because essentially it was sort of an impossibility. Okay, language, you know, it's a question. Is Europe typical? Is Europe an example? Is it necessary for universal languages of culture and learning to break down into a congeries of gradually separating languages? Will the English of the 23rd century be spoken so differently in India and China and the United States and Brazil that they'll form different languages? I don't know. But people who have been dedicated to European history kind of unconsciously feel that Europe must be a model here. Okay, let's move to another area. Celibacy. Now, this is a really, really, really important thing. Because Europe is defined as the norm, there has been a tendency to kind of not pay very close attention to the absolutely unbelievable bloodthirstiness of the Romans. You know, we say, oh, those Aztecs, gee, they were awful. They ripped hearts out on tops of, terrible. And the Romans, they were just ghastly. Really one of the most bloodthirsty group of people that ever lived. The Mongols, but the Romans. That's real stuff. Read William Harris's book on Roman warfare, and you get chapter and verse on this. But we tend not to focus on that, even though we kind of like to talk about the gladiatorial games and the exhibits in the arena, and then quote those brief passages from Romans who say, I was really disgusted by what I saw in the arena today. Because there are only a few people who were disgusted and everyone else is saying, go Lions, go Lions. But we tend to overlook that. Now, you can overlook it easily if you say that European history starts with the fall of Rome, because then you can skip the gladiatorial games. But what do you do about celibacy? Now, it isn't the instinctive yen of people to avoid sexual contact. I don't think I'm saying something that's inappropriate for a college classroom, but it isn't the normal thing. On a comparative historical basis, you find that worldwide, throughout history, almost every people has sought to reproduce. Not the Christian clergy, or at least not the Catholic clergy. There have been any number of studies on this, why celibacy became the norm, or not exactly the norm. It became the standard, although it was a standard that was violated perhaps as often as it was observed, because you have continual messages going out from Rome and through the papal hierarchy saying, try and get the housekeeper out of Father so-and-so's manse. I mean, the fact that you had rampant sexuality among the clergy was known. And by the time you get down to the 18th and 19th century, it's not only known, but it's considered really kind of kinky, and you can write pornographic works about nuns and priests and this and that. But by and large, as a standard, it had a huge impact. And it's been rather difficult. Peter Brown has probably written more about the issue of celibacy and where it comes from among recent historians. And it's tied into all sorts of things relating to the body. It isn't just the celibacy of men and women who have committed themselves to the service of the church, but it's also the whole question of the resurrection of the body. What is what is it about the body that is so important? You had one of the Byzantine era philosophers in Alexandria maintained that when you went to paradise, you got a spanking new, fresh, state-of-the-art body. You got a cool new body. You didn't have to be stuck with that old body. And they practically tore him apart for maintaining that it wasn't the old body you got. And of course, this had implications that the body has to be somehow be buried together. And then you wonder, gee, all my fingernail parings over those many decades, the hair that was cut off, do I get all that back? I don't know. What weight do you get? What age are you going to be? These things were, fascinated European Christians, and the question of the body was tied into the question of celibacy. Now, celibacy did not have a place in Islam. It did not have a place in, say, the Sanskrit religious cultures of India. In Islam, you were expected to marry. Celibacy was not forbidden. And indeed, we know, particularly from around the 1300s on, that there is kind of an increase in the number of people who maintain a non-married status. Although, and I use that term non-married instead of celibate, because in many of these cases, the biographical material indicates that they had slave concubines. Now, they refrained from marriage, but not necessarily from all of the things that come with marriage. But quite a number of them were also celibate, but it was not prohibited, but it wasn't formally sanctioned. So what difference does it make if you have celibacy? Of course, if you have the idea that being a member of the clergy is involved with ordination or special vows that set the clergy apart from other people, and that celibacy is one of the key vows, then you get the idea that the clergy are not in society, but they are a separate society, that the laity and the clergy are separate. This is something that becomes very awkward when you look at other societies. You say, well, is it normal for laity and clergy to be separated in this fashion in which the clergy are felt to have a spiritual role in which celibacy plays an important part? In the Islamic world, you were expected to marry. In Eastern Orthodoxy, you were expected to marry, except for the people at the very top of the church. What does an expectation? What does celibacy imply institutionally? Well, one thing was that people who aren't doing it don't go to the same parties as people who are. And there is the idea that the clergy should lead socially separate lives, where they will be among people of their own attainment in terms of subordinating the body to the spirit. That comes to be a given, first in the form of people who go out and live in the desert as hermits or in small groups, but over time in the form of monasticism, in which the celibate monks, only some of which are priests, most of them are not priests, but the celibate monks will live among themselves, and the celibate nuns will live among themselves. Because you just have different societies. More often than not, the monasteries and the convents for nuns get built on the margins or even in the countryside. In other words, they're not put in the center of town. There's a matter of isolation. Frequently the monasteries are surrounded by agricultural land owned by the monastery and worked by serfs who are also basically owned by the monastery and who are not celibate. They're lay brethren or serfs who do not have an oath of celibacy. So you have an institutional concomitant that you could argue would not have been there if the clergy had not had a celibacy requirement. So that in Islam, it's frequently stated by Muslim religious writers that there is no monkhood in Islam, no monasteries, which is fairly true, although not absolutely, perhaps. But if the ulama are marrying, then they have to live in society. They have wives, they have children. By and large, the ulama are men. On rare occasion, you'll have a woman. They have wives, children. They have to support themselves with businesses because they don't, for the most part, derive an income from their religious knowledge. They own property. They carry on as ordinary citizens. They are different from the laity in the sense that the laity look to them for their greater knowledge, but not in the sense that they are socially separate, that they live in separate institutions, or that they have a different life cycle deriving from their celibacy. Corollary of this, of course, is that you don't have the large number of excess women that you have to deal with. You know, if you take a substantial percentage of your male population and they're sworn to celibacy and they're going off and living in monasteries, then there are women who aren't going to get married. And what happens to them? So the whole notion of taking women and sequestering them in their own institutions is something that has virtually no parallel in the Muslim world. And it has consequences. In other words, when in the 1980s and 90s, feminist historians transformed the narrative of European history by discovering, or rediscovering perhaps, the role of women in European history. Many of the most important figures that they focused on were women who lived celibate lives as nuns, and in nunneries, and whose poetry or writings were preserved because of their particular role as a abbess of a nunnery or something like that. So women's history becomes quite different. Women's history in Islam, as in most of the world, is enormously complicated by the fact of marriage and family life. You know, when you are writing a textbook on world history and your publisher says, we want more about women in country X, you put in 2 sentences saying, women in this country, in this period, were heavily involved with marriage and family life and raising children and carrying out women's duties within the context of a marriage and householding. You don't need to have any data to write that sentence or two. You just kind of say, well, hey, that's what we can safely assume. Nobody can prove it. It isn't true. It isn't the same as saying men killed animals and women grew plants. That's a very iffy proposition. But, you know, to say that women were concerned with householding and children, you know, where's the downside of that? But the fact of the matter is, you know, in Europe you can write a women's history that is going to be far more detailed and vivid and in some respects uplifting than what you get in other parts of the world because of basically the notion that celibacy requires a sequestering of women in women's societies where they will be encouraged to engage in spiritual, and in some cases intellectual and literary activities. In the same way that the question of language, there's a question of, is Europe the norm on language? Does language differentiation lead to nationalism? It's debatable. Then there's a question of, is the European model of women somehow a prototype for the world? Or is it something that stands by itself because other parts of the world don't have the same traditions regarding women? Does the fact that you have a division between clergy and laity lead to an inherent struggle, say, between a first estate of the aristocracy, a second estate of the clergy, and a third estate of the bourgeoisie? Is that something that emerges ineluctably out of the European situation of separating clergy from laity? Or is it a model for the rest of the world? Finding common ground that gets you someplace is, I think, very difficult. I tried to finesse it by inventing a word, Islamo-Christian civilization, or a phrase. That, okay, I'll just say Muslims and Christians belong to one civilization, hooray, hooray, and I'll throw, rice in the air or something like that, and then see if I can Google it 5 years later and it swept the world in a viral fashion, and now everyone talks about Islamo-Christian civilization. No, it doesn't work that way. I thought it did, but it didn't. Instead, what you have is a real question as to whether anything that happened in Europe follows or puts into place a model or a law or a process that can or should be applied anywhere else in the world. Everyone can grant that Europe is special because all the money ended up there at one point, and all the power ended up there at one point. There's no problem with that. Of course, the Mongols did the same thing at another point. But the question is whether the specialness of Europe is simply power and pelf, or whether it really is something that arises out of the European political, institutional, spiritual, intellectual development in a fashion that can be modeled elsewhere in the world. The period that this chapter deals with ends in the year 1200. One of the reasons for ending it at that point was that you come to the end of the Crusades. That is to say, the Fourth Crusade occurs in 1204. And the Crusades, you start in 1095 with the preaching of the First Crusade, 1096. And you go to 1204 and you get the Fourth Crusade. There are a string of crusades after that, but they don't amount to a whole lot. And during this period, you bring Islam in North Africa and Europe, and North Africa and the Middle East, into direct conjunction with Western Christendom, and to a lesser degree with Greek Christendom. The tradition has been that the history of the Crusades form a monumental chapter in the history of Europe, and that they do not form a monumental chapter in the history of Islam. And that of course raises raises the question, why were they so different? Of course, in any instance where you have an invader and a defender, you can argue that the invader will always have more stories going for him than the defender. After all, it was the Achaeans who attacked Troy, and Troy just sat there and got attacked. And so we talk a lot more about the Greek side than we do about the Trojan side. So there's a little bit of that, although we don't talk a whole lot about the Japanese side in World War II. But the Crusades have raised any number of problems having to do with whether they constitute a turning point for the relations between Islam and Christian Europe. And if so, what kind of a turning point? Now, there are several options that have been adopted. On the European side, it's been observed that the Crusades changed the financial structure because people had to borrow money to go in the Crusades, and because so many knights were killed that it changed inheritance patterns. It's argued that it leads to a great rebirth of knowledge, as during that period many works are translated from Arabic into Latin. It's quite true. It's argued that it's a point where Europe comes together and Europeans interact in a way that they had not done previously. It's a period of military, aggrandizement, with the building of castles and, knights in armor, so forth and so on. On the Muslim side, what is usually pointed out is that when the Europeans came, Islam was comparatively weak, that it took a long time for it to muster its forces in some sort of response, and that as a consequence, the Crusaders were successful for a period of time in establishing small principalities in the Near East, but that basically there was little residue, that little resulted from the Crusades from the point of view of Islam, whereas a great deal resulted from the point of view of Europe. In the last lecture, I talked about things that were happening in the sort of the macro aspect of climate change. The Crusades take place during a period of the freezing of the climate of the Middle East, of the northern Middle East, and a period of uncommon warmth in Europe. From the period of the Crusades onward, Europeans become the dominant traders and seafarers of the Mediterranean and of the Atlantic, and Muslims who had previously been active in that area become of diminished importance. The question of whether there is a demographic shift underlying these different perceptions is the one I want to get to. Because what I argued last week is that the population of the eastern, let's say the northern part of the Middle East, Iraq, Iran, eastern Anatolia, that is, say, the eastern part of Asia Minor, Byzantine Empire, seem to have lost a tremendous number of people in population, starting in the beginning of the 1000s. Europe appears to have gained enormously in population starting at the same time. And seemingly both areas reacting to changes in the climatic situation that then had impacts upon the agricultural situations that they were in. So one of the possibilities here is that the changes associated with the Crusades on the European side are so dramatic because they are simply a political and military expression of a new exuberance that Europe was experiencing from reasons fundamentally unconnected to the Crusades, and that the bland and unimpressive response of the Muslims to the Crusades had to do with the great disjuncture that was being caused by the climate deterioration in the area, so that there's one crusading chronicle talks about how on such and such a day an Iranian showed up on the battlefield for the Muslims, and he was so zealous and he was such a devoted fighter that he went out to battle and was killed. And you think, okay, hothead, got killed, end of story. And then you read the rest of the chronicle and you say, that's the only Iranian who came. Why was there no army from the east when there had been armies from the east for hundreds of years before that? Why was no army from the east mustered by the caliph or the other rulers in the east to fight the Crusaders? And of course, I would answer that they simply had run out of soldiers, that they no longer had an economy that was supporting a strong and effective military regime. And that brings me to the brink of what I want to talk about next time, which has to do with longer-term effects of climate change and economic rebalancing that's associated with it, and the question as to whether those effects and that rebalancing has more to do with a kind of an automatic or theoretically dictated series of consequences, as opposed to what appears to be the radically path-dependent outcomes that you get in areas connected with religion and the clergy. So I'll stop here for today and pick this up on Thursday.